had a decision to make between two health tech companies. Both were pretty strong, and I chose the one that I thought they had made a little more progress than the other. The team had specific knowledge, and I declined on the other health tech company. A week later, the company that I said no to just emailed me and said, just wanted to let you know we raised $1 million. And this is 10 years ago, but $1 million meant something, right? I thought, did I make the wrong decision here? What happened?
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Demo Day, the podcast for entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, where we demystify the culture of joining one of the top incubators, accelerators, or VC funds from around the world. On today's episode, we'll be interviewing Paul Orlando, head of the USC Incubator program. Without further ado, let's get into Demo Day. Mr. Paul Orlando, welcome to an episode of Demo Day.
Sean, thanks so much for having me here. Really been looking forward to this for a long time.
Yeah, Paul, I've also been looking forward to it. For those that don't know you, you're both a professor at USC and lead all of the growth hacking and a lot of the entrepreneurial efforts there. You also are involved heavily in the USC Incubator. So we're super excited. I've had the chance to work with you, your students. We've had apprentices and interns from your program, and I don't have enough good things to say about what you do for USC, but just the entrepreneur community at large here in LA. So appreciate you, and we're super excited to have you.
Too kind, really too kind. But yeah, looking forward to this.
Now, Paul, in your early career, you started out in management, in consulting, and then pretty quickly you then shifted into, being a co-founder, being a CEO, and then the last probably decade plus, you've really been in the university system. So over 14, 15, 16 years in the startup ecosystem. And I've always wanted to ask you, why startups? What is it about tech helping these student entrepreneurs or, faculty entrepreneurs? What is it about the startup ecosystem that has kept you sitting in the pocket for, almost 2 decades?
Great question. And the answer to that is pretty simple. I was forced into it. So earlier in my career, I worked in more, corporate type of jobs. I was at AT&T for a while, but also in a pretty entrepreneurial group within the company. Then I went into management consulting and always really doing tech strategy or something like that for larger clients. But I had joined a, kind of boutique size consultancy in New York, which was in this growth, phase, and I was part of that growth, helping to spin up this new, really new service category. And not that soon afterwards, about a year afterwards, a new CEO came in and said, "We're going to take a different approach," and layoffs started coming. And I was laid off, and I was left with this decision. Well, what do I do? Do I try to get another job doing something similar? Or do I actually try to do something a little different, which was go back to those same clients that I had been working with, who now had no one serving them, and independently start to work with them? And the funny thing was for me that I basically was able to make the same income working a fraction of the time. It freed up, some time for me to also explore other things. And around that time, I had a few friends. We would get together every week or so. And it was more of a drinking gathering than a startup ideation gathering, I would say. But over about 6 months, we started to zone in on some ideas that we were interested in. And we kind of had this process of, hey, we'll go out, everybody kind of do some research, come back in with, some new developments or new things to kind of present internally. And we'll eventually get to this decision that we'll make. And that long process that involved many rounds of beers led to this, that first startup that I did back in New York. But you're right. It is about 15 years ago at this point.
Now, the being forced into entrepreneurship, I think, is something that a lot of entrepreneurs find that they go through because there's something that's kind of pushing them, and they really can either, react in a way, oh my gosh, I lost my job, I'm a failure, or I have to do something, and one of my favorite quotes from a mentor of mine is, he says, you can either face the wall or you could face the road. And if you're facing the wall, you should expect to hit the wall. And I always found that to be interesting that, when you're in those hard times, you've got to open up, you've got to face the road. And it sounds like that's what got you into entrepreneurship and into this world. But what's kept you here, right? We're now 15 years in. You've now had many cycles. You've had your own startup. You've seen students at freshman year go and graduate and senior and are now well into their business. So what is it about investing, tech, startups, the early molding of students that has kept you doing this year after year after year?
I became fascinated by the way founders figure things out, or often don't figure things out, or run out of time to figure things out. I became fascinated with that because, well, first of all, I had to do that, the hard way. And I guess back then, we didn't have a lot of the books and other kind of frameworks for thinking about this type of thing. But my transition from having a startup to working with lots of other founders came about. And again, this is back in New York when I had that started for a couple of years, a telecom startup. And I saw a lot of other friends who were founders, also kind of going through the same thing, struggling, often. And I put together a founder roundtable series back then that, when I first did it, I thought I've got to have a whole curriculum. It's got to be this really fleshed out formal thing. And I showed up the first day with these 8 founders who had signed up to do this thing. And I immediately threw the whole plan out the window. And what I realized was people really just wanted to talk and exchange what they were going through, ideas that they had, things that they were struggling with, get feedback from somebody else who had maybe been in that same situation. And I became I really got into that whole concept that you can, with some greater experience, you can guide people to achieving that goal that they have a little faster than if they were by themselves. I did those roundtables with maybe 6 or 7 different groups over about 6 or 7 months. I kept getting encouraged to do it again and again. And as I was reflecting on my own startup experience, I was thinking, well, maybe the next thing I could do is I could join an accelerator. New York had 10 of these programs back then. This is 2011, 2012. And I thought, okay, maybe I could join one of them. And then I started to think, well, maybe I could actually start one. And rather than trying to start the 11th one in New York, I started looking around for what might be a new market that was not yet saturated with startup accelerators, but where I could start one. There was local demand. I would be able to kind of take what I had learned and apply it in this new place. Earlier in my career, I had worked in Hong Kong. I'd worked a lot in Asia, and I thought, well, maybe there's some opportunity there. I took a quick scouting trip where I met as many people as I could in a couple of weeks, came back with the strong belief that time was right. The time was right to do something, in Hong Kong. And if I can only raise a little money to, support the investments, support my, moving there, living there. But basically in a pretty short period of time was able to do all of that. And I ended up, co-founding the first startup accelerator in Hong Kong.
Now, when was the last time you were in Hong Kong? And the reason I'm asking is if you saw something different in the personality types of being in China, being in Hong Kong, like seeing how that culture works versus the Silicon Valley, got to move, got to break things. I don't know if you've seen, especially with how fast AI is moving, and we'll be able to talk a bit about that, but did you see any differences? Or now that you've had the experience in both, have you been able to identify core cultural differences between geography, location, how people are brought up? I'm curious what you just see, for someone that's never been to China or seen any, of those accelerators there.
I'll give you kind of a funny example of how that was different. Things have obviously changed because I'm talking about Hong Kong,
2013.
Exactly, 2013. When I was there, so before I had finished, funding that first round of the startup accelerator, which was called Accelerator HK, I ran a pilot program to prove that the model worked out and to draw some attention. And I had 4 companies that were going to participate in it. And I had this one company, 2 master's students out of one of the universities in Hong Kong, smart team, all ready to go. And right before the program is going to kick off, they come to me and they say, sorry, we can't do it. Our parents are making us get real jobs. And the reality was, unlike Los Angeles, Silicon Valley, other more startup hub type of cities, in Hong Kong, certainly at that time, it was not something to do, like to start a startup. It was almost like something is wrong. Like you have difficulty finding a real job. People also typically live with their parents until they get married. Like you're expected to support, financially, say your, like the rent that the household has, or the expenses that they have. I had one guy early on who was from Hong Kong and explained it to me this way. And he said, if we went out and we met, a lady who we might be interested in, we would never say we're working on a startup, because what would be heard is, oh, this guy has no money. He couldn't get a real job. He's eventually going to get some back office role in a bank rebooting servers. So stay away. Now,
it didn't have the sexiness.
It did not at all. And as a result, the people who were kind of in that startup community back then, they were a little quirky. Even more so than the quirkiness that you'll see in the US. They were maybe international, like they had relocated maybe because a spouse or family reasons, and they kind of had this freedom to do something new. But they weren't playing into the typical, say, cultural
Series A, Series B, Series C, got to go down this path to get to where I'm trying to go.
And even more so, I used to know every single founder, every single investor in Hong Kong, because it was such a small group of people. Big city, a lot of wealth there, but it's not going into the early stage companies. It's going into the more traditional businesses, real estate, manufacturing, that type of thing. And a lot of the investors who I would speak to, who did invest in the startups, they would say, our friends think we're a little crazy for doing this, because obviously, most of the time it does not work out. And they say, well, why don't you just, go into real estate, go into these traditional businesses that you're going to get a return from, rather than, this really risky, thing that who has any idea if it's even going to survive the next couple of years.
Yeah. And then, going from China, starting the accelerator program there, education, at least from my understanding, has kind of been part of the backbone. You went to Cornell, gotten your MBA at Columbia, you have some idea. You even mentioned for your first startup group, what kind of curriculum could I put together? What was your internal dialogue around transitioning into the university system? And how did you decide that USC was where you wanted to plant your flag?
It was kind of accidental. So how did I end up in Los Angeles is the other question. So I was in New York, then I was in Hong Kong, ended up in Los Angeles. And the reason was my wife decided to go back to school. So she went to the medical school at USC. I didn't know anybody in Los Angeles when we ended up here. And again, I reached out cold to a number of places. I happened to get routed around. It was probably 5 different people in this chain, but I got routed to the Entrepreneurship Center at USC. And they said, come on over, let's talk. I thought, fantastic. I'll meet new people. I'll find what I eventually end up doing in Los Angeles, because I'm still exploring that. So I show up, and the conversations were going really differently than I expected. And I realized kind of partway through, I'm on an interview. And I'm not really sure what I'm interviewing for. So, and I'm meeting the next round, the next person in the office, and thinking they're talking about this incubator that they want to build, and I'm giving these examples of an accelerator I had just built and a startup I had also founded, and what I had learned in doing all of that. And I came away realizing like I just went on a series of interviews to build a new program, a new incubator program for the campus. So I hadn't seen like the job description. Like I go back home, like I'm Googling, like, like what is this job that I find that, I find the role that I had just interviewed for. And it really just worked out. It was really just
The perfect fit.
perfect timing and the perfect fit. And as soon as I was hired there, they started to ask me to teach. Out of that experience, going back to your earlier question about like, the growth hacking class and how that came together. When I was first hired, I came in and I had never worked in a university before. So I said, I'm going to talk to as many people as I could. I probably spoke to like 80 or 100 students those first couple of months. I spoke to as many faculty as I could, staff. And I came away thinking, okay, there is a little gap in what's being taught now. There isn't anything that is, like this growth hacking topic or, growth marketing topic. So I put together a proposal to create this class. And eventually, multiple levels of approval to create this new thing, which doesn't happen that often, and ended up teaching that. But I wanted it to be like as real, as hands-on, as practical as possible.
Yeah, and maybe you could speak a little bit more on both what you saw at the time, because when you and I first met, I was drawn to the fact that you had a growth hacking class. It was a newer terminology. There's business school, there's marketing, there's advertising, but growth hacking, that's what I wanted to be in. That's why I started Coefficient Labs. And so to have a professor that was kind of like teaching the mentality of applying, lean methodologies to marketing, or to think about how product development plays a role in user acquisition or in LTV or growth, like there was so much that you were teaching. I don't believe that every university has a growth hacking class or a department. Why is it so necessary? For those educators that are listening now, or for the universities that are thinking about new classes, why is growth hacking, even though this is, probably 2013, 2014, 2015 is really when it kind of started in that way, but like, why is it so important for traditional marketing classes to start shifting more towards a growth mentality?
If you understand growth, and I always think of this as coming in two parts, but if you understand how to grow a business, a product, just how it works, you're going to be at an advantage. And so my approach to that class is, okay, there are the things that are just foundational and they're not going to change. So that is, how do you calculate lifetime value, customer acquisition cost? Like, how do you understand, how that system works? And, the techniques will change over time. Things that we did in that class when it was brand new, like they long since stopped working, right? New platforms come up, new platforms for distribution, ways of acquiring customers. They emerge all the time. But there is that foundation that's going to remain. And the number of people, by the way, who are at pretty established businesses, but they don't really have a good handle on their unit economics, it's more common than not, unfortunately. So that's kind of my foundation in the classroom. But then I have the out of the classroom piece, and this is where I think it's really important. Back to your question about like, why is it important in a university to have a class like this? Just that topic, that growth hacking, growth marketing topic, it's always seeking like the new technique, like that edge that you're going to have. And maybe that edge is really short-lived, but you discovered something, it's working. Maybe you don't want to spread the news about this too soon, but you've figured something out, and eventually others are going to figure it out as well. To do that, I realized, I would benefit from having other people who do this day in and day out come in and talk a little bit about it, and also guide some of the students in that way. So when you've come into class, when I've had others come in, you always share new techniques that, like, I might not be the expert in TikTok, right? I'm not going to like focus on that one thing, but there are people who live in, like they breathe that, and they can talk about like distribution and the specifics of how they're doing the videos and all of that. So it's that balance, I figure.
Yeah, I mean, I remember going into your class that first time and I said, I put the word growth hacking up on the board and I said, what is the definition of growth hacking? And, a student raised his hand and, oh, it's, using engineering and marketing. And then another student raised and I said, no, growth hacking is a mindset, right? Because like you said, there's always going to be new channels, podcasts, ad platforms, cold outreach. There's like so many different ways, but as long as you have that foundation, like you said, of a growth mindset, you're able to adjust, along the way. And, I wanted to ask you this question, and I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about like the future of education, what it looks like. But when I was listening to you tell that story about how you had interviewed dozens, 100 even students, there was a story that one of your students had said something like, my marketing professor hasn't even heard of Kickstarter before. And that was kind of your like, wait a minute, what? Like, I can't believe the marketing department isn't aware of these new tools that are coming. And my question to you is like, Kickstarter obviously in 2015 was the thing. However, now it's AI, Anthropic, Claude, ChatGPT, and it feels like there's a power struggle that's happening between universities that say you're not allowed to use ChatGPT. I don't want you using it for essays. I don't want you using it for research. And then you have others that are fully embracing it and are fully understanding, the implications of preparing students. I know for me personally, and I'm sure there are lots of founders like me and lots that are different. I don't care at all where you went to school, but I definitely care what sort of experience you have with some of these tools. Do you come in with Photoshop experience? Do you know how to do editing? Can you use these AI platforms to code? And I was curious, like, in your opinion, what are universities still missing today, the way that they were missing Kickstarter in 2015?
That question, and thanks for bringing up that example, that question, like that Kickstarter answer that I heard from that MBA student probably about 10 years ago, is one that, there's echoes of it today. So you can, in pockets of any university as a faculty member, you can, stay a little behind on what is changing. For some disciplines, maybe that doesn't matter that much, but for others, and certainly in a business school, I really think you owe it to yourself and to the students to stay on top of these new opportunities. So the AI question is one that in my whole time in universities, and so in about a decade, it's the one that's had the most, the most awareness, the most, confusion, also the most, I think, opportunity. This whole swirling set of questions around how to use AI, what should or should not be allowed in a classroom, where can we take education as a result. My approach was, for the last, at this point, more than 3 years, I've made it mandatory in my classes. You must be using it. Now, in growth hacking and some of the other classes I teach, it actually does change what you can do. A lot of the students that I would have, not all, but a lot of them were business students, maybe without a lot of tech knowledge or tech skills. They couldn't necessarily build, even something as basic as, a website using, WordPress, right? Or they hadn't done that. They hadn't had a class, and they also
didn't have a friend.
Didn't have a friend, right? Certainly couldn't have built an app that's deployed to the App Store. They couldn't have done anything like more sophisticated like that. Now they've just become leveled up. So all of those ideas that they had, and maybe their strengths in talking to potential customers, understanding the business models, all of those things that were their strengths, but they were kind of held back on the technical side. They've just been leveled up, and they can certainly spin up. It might not be perfect. It might not be production ready. Yeah, maybe there are security flaws, but they can certainly spin up a working prototype. And it completely changes what they're able to do in a short amount of time.
It must be so interesting for you in that position, because I think for a lot of the tech ecosystem, myself included, we get a lot of like, how quickly is this moving or what can you do with it from platforms like Twitter, right? Where you go on and it's this like, I'm using OpenClaw for this, I'm using Claude Code for that. And you have this kind of a little bit of a detachment. You know that it's happening, you know it's possible, but you've had this experience of being able to kind of hover around startups at the earliest stages, let's say 5-6 years ago. They're grinding it out, you know. I gotta find that developer. Paul, can you introduce me to that advisor? And you kind of watch them slowly get. Now I could imagine you walk in and people come up to you with an idea, and by the end of the 2 hours in the incubator, they're like, "Check this out! I built a little MVP." It must be so cool for you to see at such a close distance and so many different startups all at the same time. What's that been like for you watching that evolution, and what does that mean for accelerators in general? You know, one of the questions that I had was like, why should a founder even consider going to an accelerator? Why not just go out and raise funding? So I'm curious, like, what you've seen and why accelerators could be such a great option for founders.
Right. Well, there's a few questions in there. So first of all, I will say not everyone is trying this. You know, this
You're still seeing some lagging. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it is partly, you know, there's a lot of inertia, even at the young age, the student age, definitely at the older or faculty type of persona. And if you're comfortable with a certain way of doing things and you're not really forced to change, you know, there's going to be a little delay, you know, there. But I just look at it as here's all this opportunity. Like any little idea for a side project that you had, you could probably, well, if not do the entire thing, you could probably get pretty far down that path and decide, hey, this was just for fun, I'm doing this. Or, oh, actually, maybe this is a potential business. But on the accelerator question, so you're right. The calculation does change a bit. And really, I think accelerators were never solely about funding because coming in the door, I mean, the check it's pretty small. You know, say if it's 100K, it's not going to last you with a team, you know, and paying people, it's not going to last you that long. The intention really should be much more about, okay, the guidance is valuable, the network is valuable, the ability to, after the program, continue to plug into other founders, investors, mentors, subject matter experts who are just going to speed up what you can do. Like that's really where the value should be, rather than like that little check, or even in a demo day, you know, like, okay, this is going to speed up, you know, the time that it takes us to raise money afterwards. But now, if, well, you can get a lot further with, you know, that little check than you could have earlier. You get, you know, more shots on goal. Hey, like what would have taken us, you know, maybe months and months to develop now is, you know, days, you know, weeks, hours, maybe in some cases. So it does give you kind of like more chances to iterate quickly. You do still benefit from that guidance because
Totally.
You know, today we can build faster than ever before, but if you're, you know, if it is kind of like random, then, you know, the outputs might also be, you know, a bit random. But if instead you say, okay, because we can shoot ahead faster than ever before, we do still need to be intentional on the direction that we want to go in. That guidance will play in, you know, in that area.
Yeah, and I think, you know, everyone goes through, you know, whether I think Seth Godin calls it like the dip, or Alex Hormozy calls it, you know, like the valley of destruction, but it's sort of like, you know, everyone kind of goes through this, you know, the way Alex Hormozy describes it is you sort of have uninformed optimism where you're like, I don't know why, but I think this is going to work. And then you start to get some informed pessimism where you're like, wait, this actually is harder than I thought. And then you kind of keep sinking down into the depth of despair where it's like you have to grind your way through it. And a lot of people quit at that moment and then start back again at uninformed. I'll just try the next thing like that. This isn't working. And I think a lot of it is being able to push through that, you know, that bottom of the barrel. And it's very easy when you're in that place to be like, How come no one else is feeling this way? How come I'm the only founder that can't figure out how to get out of this? And being in an accelerator or community or an incubator where you realize, like you were talking about in that story, people sitting around, oh, wait a minute, everyone is going through this exact same thing, and maybe their approach is slightly different than mine. And so I definitely see both the value from the community, the resources, the mentors. What is something that you thought or something you expected about running the incubator that turned out not to be true?
Oh, very interesting question. When it was brand new, all of the attention and all the companies that were accepted in were current students, largely undergrad. And what happened over the next year or so was there was a shift. And I still saw a lot of applications from students, but I started seeing more and more applications from alumni. So today, it is mostly alumni who come into this program. People who have already worked for a number of years, they already understand their industry, they have maybe dealt with this specific customer target, for years. They really can apply that specific knowledge to whatever it is that they are building. And they also didn't necessarily, as alumni, they didn't necessarily have other places that they could go. They might not be a great fit for an accelerator because maybe they are keeping the day job and they have, a house and kids and a spouse. They can't completely plunge 100% in just yet. But they do recognize they want that guidance, that network of other founders, investors, mentors as part of their progression to possibly doing this full time. So part of my surprise was, the majority of founders I work with in the incubator at USC, they are mostly alumni with some experience who come in to participate.
That's really interesting. Now, let's pretend that you and I are at dinner, okay? And I bring my my little brother in, okay? And he is, a senior in high school. He's about to go to school. Maybe he's even going to USC. And I say, oh, buddy, you got to meet my friend Paul. He runs this incubator program, this accelerator at USC. And he goes, what is the incubator? What's an accelerator? How does it work? How do you describe, what is it? What should people expect, whether you're alumni, a student? Let's just pretend it's day one and I'm showing up at the incubator. How does it kind of work? And for people that can't even imagine what that would be like, what's like a normal week or month or year look like when you're in the program?
Sure. So I'll describe what it looks like at this program at USC, and the answer is going to be different for any of the other programs I've run, different parts of the world, different themes to them. But at USC, it works like this. So there is an application process, pretty typical application, but I'm really looking for a few things. It's coachability. Why participate in something like this if you're not at least open to outside suggestions? Doesn't mean that I or other mentors are going to run the business for you, but at least be open. Another is we're looking for commitment to seeing this through. In the early days, I would sometimes have very promising teams be a part of it, usually the student teams. And then I would be surprised at the end of the year and they'd say, well, we're shutting down the business. And I'd be a little confused. Well, I thought things were going pretty well. Why? Oh, well, I got a job at Meta. He's going to Snapchat. And I kind of would rather give that spot. There's not many spots. I'd rather give that spot to somebody who's actually going to give it like a shot and not just take the first job. The decision is very personal, right? Sometimes you have to do that. But I would probably rather bias the decision to someone who is really committed to seeing this through. Another is that you have most of the capabilities to build what you need within the team. Now, typically, these are pretty small teams, 2, 3, 5 people. But call it 80%, we're looking that you have like, most of that capability within that team, rather than saying, oh, if only we could find someone who could do this and this, then we'd be set. I'm also really looking for people who are a good impact on the community. So whether that means, you will answer a question in the Slack group, you will make an introduction to someone, you will help someone out by, practicing their presentation before they go meet an investor, anything like that. It's really, I'd say like that founder community, it's one of the great strengths of this incubator at USC.
Something that you mentioned earlier that I thought would be really good just to bring up, because there's a lot of people coming from the Midwest to San Francisco or the East Coast to Los Angeles, or moving from LA to Austin. But this idea of like moving from like where you have your built-in base and your friends and your ecosystem. And what I've taken from your story of going from, New York and Hong Kong and LA, you've always been the person to organize the event rather than attend the event. And I think that there's something really powerful in that, because a lot of people, especially when you move to a new place, are like, how am I going to meet the right people? Oh, there's a mixer happening. Oh, there's this event happening. And you go to these places, but you still kind of feel a little out of touch because you're like, I don't know anyone. I'm just showing up. I paid the $20. But I think a lot of people miss the entire concept of like, you can literally be the one to host the event, invite the 4 to 6 people, and now you are the center of that. And even though no one knows who you are, I'm sure people came up, oh, Paul, thanks for organizing this group. Yeah, we should connect afterwards. And I just think for anyone listening that is struggling right now to feel like they're fitting into the event scene, to just be the people, get the Slack channel, be the person to create the Reddit thread, be the guy or gal that brings a small group of people. I just think that that's something that you don't learn in school, and people don't really understand how when you are the person hosting, you are on a different level playing field, even when you have less experience, less support, less, money in the bank. And anyway, it was something that I heard, and I want other students and early entrepreneurs to hear, because that is a growth hack. Being the guy visiting an event versus hosting, to me, is a growth hack. And it's something I think a lot of people don't even think about. And you can use Paul as an example of like, you could be the new guy and still do it. It's still possible. Now, one of my favorite things about you is like, you always, at least from my perspective, it's like you have your own experiences, you're teaching the youth, you're helping the broader community, but you've always been a writer. You've always been a book creator. You've always been someone that likes to get your ideas and your philosophies out. And at least for me, the thing that I've connected with the most from your content has been this concept of why now. I mean, you wrote an entire book about this concept of why now. And for those listening, my understanding is the premise of why now is really that like timing is as important. It's like a first class variable in your startup. It's not just some afterthought, and that a lot of founders will focus on, is the product good? Is the team strong? Is the market big enough? Is the unit economics viable? But in listening to you talk about it, it seems like part of your philosophy is like, even if all of those things are true, you can still fail if the timing isn't right. And I wanted to understand more, like, can you talk more about the why now concept, why it's important to you, and maybe like how you use it as a tool in mentoring your entrepreneurs?
I love this why now topic. And whenever I've written, so I wrote a couple books, they all came after struggling with those questions for a little while. And then it was more natural to write. But I became fascinated with this timing topic. And the reason was, so I had a startup in New York that was a little too early. It was a voice, based, we took care of patient communications. So as part of a recovery process, you could talk to another patient. Building the tech behind that was pretty difficult back then. Now, yeah, you could probably do that.
This couple of API calls.
Yeah, exactly. And you see that kind of repeated again and again. Here is a startup that's doing really well. Oh, but it's pretty similar to something that was around 5 years ago, 10 years ago, .com era, 25 years ago. So what is it about timing that goes into how startups succeed. I became fascinated with this topic, and I was doing workshops on it. I was researching it. I was talking to a lot of people, and there's pretty common recognition that, yeah, timing is important. In fact, there's even research. There was this one research report where they spoke to 800 VCs, and timing for successful investments and failed investments was in like the top 2 reasons behind like why they succeeded or why they failed. And yet, even though people recognize timing is very important, I never saw anyone go deep into this topic. Can we figure out, are we on time to do this? Are we too early? Can we get some clues? And so my process was, let me figure out what are those clues that help us determine, yes, the timing is right or not. What do I then say about like the team that we have? Like, are we right for this specific, like to move quickly? Or are we better off if we hold back a bit? But I basically was able to put together what I think is a pretty helpful framework for analyzing what is changing in the environment, which is probably outside of your control as a founder, but you're noticing new technology, regulation, something like a new distribution technique. But, there's something that's changing there. There's a positive impact on your business model as a result, which is the crucial piece that a lot of people miss. And then, you are the right team to either move really quickly and take advantage, or you're actually better off hanging back a bit and then learning from the mistakes of others, entering later on, maybe as a specific niche player. A lot of ways that you could take this, but I think that appreciation of like that why now question is one where if more founders, thought a bit about that, or if they read that Why Now book, I think you'll be at a great advantage.
Now, you've had the chance to be involved in backing so many early stage companies. What is the most underrated quality that you see in successful founders? And I'd like to I think I'm a little biased because I got my start in college. I was in the, launch pad at University of Miami. I love teaching at your classes. And so I have this affinity towards the unseen star that's sucked in school, but triumphantly grows through college and starts their business or drops out and makes it happen. What do you see as the most underrated qualities, especially in your student entrepreneurs? Because now more than ever, if you're a student on campus, you're like, what business should I start? Should I be a streamer? Should I be a creator? Should I start an e-commerce dropshipping business? Should I set up Claude code for people? There's like so much opportunity. And so I'm curious, like when you look at some of your earlier youthful, just kind of breaking out of their shells, what is the most underrated quality that you see in successful founders?
It's probably something as basic as attitude. So remaining optimistic, going again in the face of uncertainty, in the face of really bad news, being able to go out that second day. I had these 2 students. They were actually students of mine, not in the growth hacking class, in a class I taught earlier. And they had this other business that did okay, but wasn't really working out. At least wasn't going to be anything more than a side project. And they decided to shut that down, but the team stuck together. They then went, and by the way, they did not do well in that class.
And I'd have it no other way.
I was like, I'm glad I did not give them a good grade. It's like, but the team stuck together and they worked they had the office right next to me in the incubator, and they were always there. And they came up with the next thing. And when I caught up with one of them as they were just starting this new thing, he was talking about how they were doing cold outreach on LinkedIn. And this was something that we had spoken about. And at a certain price point where there's no, you don't need a committee meeting. It's you just put it on a corporate card. At a certain price point, absolutely. That will get you, your first customers. Go ahead and do that. And we spoke about pricing. So they started to double the pricing. They doubled it again and again. And they were growing. They were also doubling every month. So like, in other words, increasing price was not slowing down the likelihood of people to sign up and do it. It wasn't increasing churn. And they grew tremendously. So this was a company that would put a phone short code or a phone number on like a CPG product. It's on a shelf, packaged goods. Those companies don't necessarily know that much about who takes those products off the shelf. Like they get some very high level data, or like months later they get some like high level credit card data, but it's not necessarily as useful as it could be. So they would put this phone number that you could text into, and you get in like a chatbot discussion, collect demographic information. Certainly you have like the phone number. You could tell, okay, who are our customers? And then you could also push out a discount. You could push out awareness of maybe a new product that's being released, right? So they raised around, I think, 90 million, overall in doing this, and then were acquired a couple years ago.
Wow.
But same team. Like the first thing didn't really work out that well, shut it down. They could have just said, we gave it a shot. This is too hard. Let's do something else. Let's get a regular job. But they remained pretty upbeat during the whole time. And even when I would go and visit their offices and nothing was going on, really, like it was tough. It was tough. Like, once they moved out of the incubator, it's like, do we leave too soon? Like, we have rent now to pay. Like, should we have just, kept costs, down? But yeah, that attitude, I think, is really important, because you don't know what's going to come your way. You don't know when new changes, new competitors going to come up. So yeah, pay attention to attitude.
Now, when let's say that a student or even a faculty or an alumni comes in and they apply to get into the incubator, I'm sure you guys get more applications than you're able to actually accept on any given program. Are students or other cohorts allowed to reapply again if they didn't get in the first time?
About 10% have applied more than once.
10%. And so within that, I think sometimes this is, I think, especially important for younger, earlier founders, where they start fundraising or start applying to incubators. In some cases, it's not a good fit and they say no. How should a founder act when they get a no? Like what's the perfect, in your mind, way if you're mentoring someone and they come to you, oh, Uncle Paul, I didn't get into this incubator and that VC didn't understand, blah, 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 and they get a little defensive. What sort of advice do you have for founders that receive a no from an incubator or a VC fund?
When the program was pretty new, I was keeping the cohorts pretty small. I had a decision to make between two health tech companies. Both were pretty strong. And I chose the one that I thought was, they made a little more progress than the other. The team had specific knowledge. There was an MD that was the CEO. So I went with them and I declined on the other health tech company. And a week later, the company that I said no to just emailed me and said, just wanted to let you know, we raised $1 million. And this is 10 years ago when $1 million meant something, right? So I thought, did I make the wrong decision here? What happened? But it worked out. So the company that I did accept, they were actually our first acquisition of the program. But that other company stayed in touch with me. And every couple months, they'd send me an email update. What's going on, growth, difficult things that they're also dealing with. And I stayed in touch with the founder. A few years later, he called me up and he wanted to talk and said, you remember how we had raised money back then? We've got this terrible problem with our investors. We actually raised that $1 million from like 20 small angel investors who,
pushing us around.
They're pushing us around. They're like, they are not, they were like, doctors and dentists. They were like, the health, the healthcare, type of persona, but they didn't necessarily understand, wow, a lot of these startups don't seem to work out. Where's the money? I want one back, right? So there was that disconnect and they were dealing with that. And I ended up helping him and also connecting him to some other people who helped him kind of negotiate through that difficulty. Kept in touch. Well, now actually they're on a little better footing. And we also started talking about, in fact, this is another example of where pricing was actually really important. I was talking to them about their pricing, which was, I thought, scandalously low. And again, like, try to increase it. And again, another example where not much impact on how many people will say yes to the service. And eventually we're like doing all this work together, and I said, well, why don't you join the incubator? I'm already talking to you a lot. Like, why don't you actually just participate? And they did, and they participated. So this is probably 3 or 4 years after that first no. So out of that, what happened? They ended up hiring some students because now they are kind of plugged back into campus. They got all this other feedback from other founders, other people I brought in, a little easier for me also to meet them because they're right there. So to your question, if you hear that no, it doesn't necessarily mean, well,
no
that
forever.
Was it. No forever. Let's never talk again. But you can take that approach of, I bet there were other things going on. They can't say yes to every single person. Maybe there's a restriction on how many startups can actually come into the program. So keep the door open. That could mean, hey, it's an email every couple months. It's a check-in periodically. It's even, hey, let me reach out and still ask for your input or help on something that is kind of a point of struggle for us. A connection, maybe. You prove that, okay, you're serious. You're figuring things out. You're open enough to ask for input. And then when the opportunity comes along a little later on, well, then it's much more natural for you to come right in. So yeah, keep the doors open. Yeah.
A lot of what you do is work with teams at this early stage. Sometimes they're just one person solo founders. Sometimes they're teams of 2 or 3 or 4, but you're still getting them almost even before they're really building out that early team. What advice do you have for founders when building the early team, whether things you've learned from your own founder experience or from seeing so many of these startups, especially the ones that don't last? I think that ultimately, like you said, there's going to be timing is a part of it for sure. There's also just running out of money. And then there's like founder split ups. I would imagine you have some students come in for a project. No one's that excited or passionate, but maybe one person is, right? In most of those, there's always that one person that wants to carry it forward, and maybe the other teammates don't. But I think that sometimes we don't realize like how much time is lost had you not made that early decision to work with that other student that's not really in it. You could have worked with someone else that is in it. And, I've always taken this piece of advice from a friend of mine. He said, every wrong hire you make costs you 9 months of your life. 3 months to find them, 3 months to realize it's not the right fit, 3 months to replace them with someone new. And I think in a startup ecosystem, it's hard to realize how impactful losing 9 months is. Having someone, getting them working, having them do stuff only to leave. So in your opinion, what advice do you have for founders when thinking about building their early team, especially in an incubator or accelerator environment?
It's so important. Statistically, something like a third of startups that fail, about a third of the time, it's because of co-founder issues. The team fights, break up, somebody quits, suddenly. I had a situation like that in my old startup in New York. We had somebody who quit a little unexpectedly after a few months. So what I do as a result is I have everyone, before they enter, so you've been accepted to the incubator, before you come in, and by the way, I do the same thing for the funded accelerators I've run. Before you walk in the door on that first day, you must have a co-founder agreement in place. So you've discussed responsibilities, okay, how we're doing this full time or we're doing this part time, or this person is putting in some of their own money or not, or what kind of expertise are you bringing versus me? What is that equity split? What's the vesting schedule? All of those things that people tend to push off until later. We're best friends. We'll deal with it later. Of course of course in my mind, it's, like 60-40. And of course the other person says, well, I thought it was 90-10. Right. So you get all of those things that you just assume away, or it's a little uncomfortable. I don't want to actually bring this up with a friend. Later. Have that discussion, and then you just write it down. A page, 2 pages, you should be able to do this. And it's both that you have the discussion, and also a year later, when maybe times are a little tough and memories change, you can refer back to this document and say, oh, you're right. We did agree to do this and this. So just having that has reduced, in my programs, it's reduced the failure rate by 10 to 20%. Just that. And, it's so like, basic of a thing, but it's one of those questions that people don't want to go through the effort to try to answer because it's a little awkward.
Yeah. It's almost a good thing it's like you're the bad guy. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, we got in the program, but we kind of have to do it, instead of me being like, hey, I'm just in case things don't work out. It's like, it's Paul's fault that we have to do this, So I love that. Now, when you think about your career, you could come at this from the perspective as an investor or as a incubator, director, or as a teacher. I'm just, either flow is fine. I'm just curious, what is the part of your professional journey that you are personally the most proud of?
Oh my, that is a difficult question. On the one hand, I want to say it's been the ability to take what I've learned and synthesize it into the writing that I've done. But probably, at least if you're asking me that question, I'm answering kind of from the heart. It's more that I hear from a founder or a student I worked with years earlier. And in some cases, I don't even remember this conversation, but they come back and they say, I just want to tell you, I remember when you said, X, Y, and Z, and that really helped me. And I went off to do this and this and this. And, the funny thing is, I had one of these recently, somebody who came back and I said, wow, it's so great to hear that. And I was thinking, I don't even remember the conversation because there's I guess enough of these. Yeah, there's enough of these. Yeah, there's enough of these. For him, that was like the one that really made a difference, right? So certainly hearing things like that.
Now, within an incubator or an accelerator, there's a little bit more parameters. Like you said, these aren't the biggest checks. It's a little bit more, we kind of have a way of doing it here. But just from like what you're seeing in the world and kind of having, quote unquote LPs and investors and just kind of knowing what's going on, how would you describe the current state of the funding ecosystem? When you're talking to your students and you go, hey, this is a safe environment here, but when you walk out this building, right, you got to pay rent, you're going out into the world here. This is what you should be aware of. This is what's happening right now in the VC ecosystem. Have you developed a perspective of how to communicate with students the differences between COVID versus post-COVID versus recession? It's like we've gone through different cycles these past 6 years. How would you describe the current state?
I try to stay a bit away from that. And the reason is I go back typically just to the basics. So even in the best times, it's difficult to raise money. If you think of like that early COVID era, zero interest rate era, when the valuations, like there were more unicorns in the US created then than ever before, not because like great companies were being created, but the valuations were just being boosted up by all this like easy money that was flowing. You can't control that as a founder. That's something that's happening, at like the macro level. That's like beyond your control. What you can control is, are you good at bootstrapping in good times or bad? Like you can survive. So you can survive long enough to either be able to raise money Or maybe you can survive long enough to the point that you don't need to raise money or don't need to raise that much money. So I tend to default back to that, because if you are too responsive to what is changing in the investment world, it can skew you in different directions that are not always helpful. So, a number of years ago, whether it was COVID era or even times before that, where if it was economy-wide or specific sectors where they just became like the hot sectors, for a while, it completely, turns things upside down. It's like, doesn't matter what you're losing money for every customer.
Amazing.
But, growth. Like, I had this one, so I joined as an interim head of growth a couple of years ago. I guess this must have been like towards the tail end of that period. So maybe this is 2022. And this company, and I went in, they brought me in part for the unit economics piece. Like, let's actually figure out what's actually going on, here, because we don't really know. We're spending all this money on customer acquisition, and like, how does it actually, turn into LTV? And it was kind of difficult to get the data, first of all. And I finally got it. I realized, well, it's never coming back. It's not like it's coming back in 3 years. It's like never coming back based on your pricing, based on your cost structure, based on the churn that you have. So we can't spend on these channels. It's like you're paying too much for customer acquisition now, or you have to radically change how you can charge. And, that's uncertain. And, at the time they said, yeah, but we need to show top line growth because we're trying to raise the next round. And I remember in this discussion, so the investors don't actually dig in that much to realize that you're losing money on every customer, but the top line growth is the number that they're looking for. In that world. Now, a little different. So I think, I'm pretty traditional probably in this respect. You build a business that, it's going to survive in the good times and the bad times. Those bootstrapping skills will help you no matter what. And yeah, maybe you lose out on some of those kind of quirky opportunities where this sector just happens to be really hot and you kind of go for it, but then you still have to build a sustainable business in the end. So I guess that's been my approach to that.
Now, what is one piece of advice? I asked you earlier if there was anything that you had started in the incubator, started in your professional experience that later turned out not to be true. A different question that I have around it is, can you share a piece of advice or wisdom that you wish you had known earlier in your career?
Piece of wisdom I wish I had known earlier in my career.
Yeah, and said another way, if you were to start all over again and you were speaking to your younger self and you're like, with the wisdom you have now, with the experiences in the incubator and seeing the successes, seeing the failures, like knowing what you do now, if you were going to start the USC Incubator all over again from scratch, what's one piece of advice you'd give yourself?
I'd probably say, don't take it too personally. I might, and this is also an attitude kind of thing, perspective question. If you take it very personal, it's when the times are tough, you're going to feel, my fault, I should have done this versus that. But instead, hey, everyone is, I've heard so many examples of, there actually are no adults. Everyone is kind of the kid figuring out what is happening and what to do. Yeah. And maybe sometimes kind of pretending that, I know what's going on. So there's certainly a bit of that. And be a little easier on yourself as a result. And just recognize, everyone is kind of figuring things out, reacting to change, as well as, charting that new course of change. So I think, maybe, just back to that attitude.
I feel like it's got to be especially hard for you because you could take things so personally in your environment for different reasons. Like, why did those founders just all of a sudden stop working? Like, don't they know how hard I worked on it? Or, like, oh man, if I had just made that introduction to that one person, or so I could see how easy it could be with everyone at such an early stage. They're all with their lifelines trying to grab anything they can to stay alive. So that's, I think that's a really good piece of advice for yourself. I hope you take it more and more. What is one book that has changed your life and why?
Oh my.
And you can use your own book too. Just
Oh, I feel. Can I name two books? Oh my. Okay. I'm gonna name a book that everybody knows and is actually one that probably very few people bring up. So after the fires last year, and we were, in a hotel for a while, and then we were in Airbnbs for a while.
For those that don't know, you lived in Pacific Palisades.
Or in Altadena.
Altadena, sorry. Yeah.
So, and we kind of like ran out with just like a couple bags, and I read all the time, and I didn't have any books with me. And I'm in this hotel, and I have no books, and I'm not sleeping at all, by the way. That night, I'm like just like refreshing, the browser, looking at, what the impact is. And it's 3 a.m, and I'm sitting in the bathroom because my kids are asleep. And I can't just like keep refreshing the page. And I thought, I'd really like to read something. And I realized, there is one book in here. It's like, okay. So I got the Bible, actually. This is probably like the only time I've, that said something like this. And I started reading it in the bathtub. And I made that like the thing I would do every night, like, because I wasn't sleeping. So like, I'm just going to read this. And I found, this was really like the perfect time for me to read this kind of stuff.
Where, if you don't mind me asking, like, where was it coming from? Boredom, therefore this is all I have? Was it coming from what's happening in my house? God, like, what is, like, what was the sort of impetus to kind of make you go past the first page, let's say?
Initially, it was, this is the only book.
I'm in the bathroom of a hotel, and my house is burning down.
This is the only one. Initially it was that, and then I kind of realized I've never really read this stuff. Like I have general awareness. I've actually never really read it, and that, I don't know, both the situation I was in, certainly, which was pretty stressful. And also just, there isn't another book. And the only, little place that you can go with the lights, to turn on the lights is like, the bathroom in a hotel. So yeah, that was a kind of a very, different experience. Any other book I would mention, I've read because, there's 1,000 other books available, and you go into any library or Amazon, you could choose anything. But that kind of was, I don't know, it was very meaningful.
What I'm curious, like, I think there's a lot of people, myself included, that resonate with the storyline of like, of course I've heard of the Bible, I grew up religious, but I've never gone page by page and read through it. For those, back to Uncle Paul here, like what did you learn about yourself, or what did you learn about the book, or what was it about it that started opening your eyes more, or what connected you with it? I'm curious, like, what did you notice about yourself as you started going through it?
So first of all, everyone has dealt with really tough times, much more difficult than anything I was going through. Like, there's nothing new about that. In fact, a lot of those stories are like, like 1,000 times, more difficult, what people are going through. And there's just that commonality of that human experience. Hey, like these pages were written thousands of years ago, but often really applicable to the modern day. Sure, you modernize certain things about it, or you take some things with there's a metaphor implied. It's not completely like historical fact in every situation. But that was actually like really, I don't know, helpful, eye-opening, and without that that surprise situation with the fires and that kind of time that I had, I probably would not have ever sat down to do that. Yeah.
If you could give a special shout out to anyone in the world that has made a monumental impact on your life, and maybe you haven't had a chance to let them know how special or meaningful they've been, is there anyone that comes to mind that really, similar to that student, you believe they deserve a shout out?
Sean, there's only one answer to this question. It's my wife. Yeah, my wife, Susan. Hi, baby boo. Of course, all the good things in my life come from her.
That's awesome, Paul. What are you most excited about this year? It's getting towards the end of February. Things are already feeling like they're moving fast. What are you most excited about this year?
Certainly building more things with AI, more reading and writing. I've gotten, I'll mention one thing I've gotten interested in terms of writing again. I don't know that I will really do this whole project, but became interested in Luddite movements. So if you don't know that term, these were the people in England a couple hundred years ago who were smashing the mechanized looms. So they were textile weavers, and they were smashing the machines that were putting them out of business. And we have, as I've discovered, many situations in history that are like this. We have, in textile, but in transportation, communications, in printing, there's some type of job that's been there historically, and then a new technology comes in, displaces it, and how do people react? Do they smash the machines, or do they say, maybe I can have a place in this, in this new world? So we're certainly in a situation like that now with AI. Do you choose to smash the machines, or instead do you say, well, I want to be a part of that new world that's going to emerge, and I can still guide it, but I can't completely block it off. Mm-hmm. So I've become interested in that. But otherwise, yeah, I've also ended up having a lot of discussions and other consulting work with different groups, sometimes international groups, where they either want to build an accelerator or some type of entrepreneurship program, either say encouraging or developing regional entrepreneurship or businesses, or even company. I've done some talks on that why now topic and consulted on that topic for typically for larger companies that are trying to apply that to the portfolio of products they are developing in-house. So I don't know. A number of things keep me interested.
That's awesome, Paul. Well, listen, this has been an awesome podcast. I've enjoyed every second of it. I appreciate you for making the trip over here from beautiful Palos Verdes near my hometown. And I just want to say thank you. Again, it's been fun to grow with you. I feel like we're getting close to a decade now of knowing each other and being a part of each other's growth. And I just couldn't thank you enough for making it down today.
Thank you. This is a pleasure. Thanks, Sean.
Awesome, Paul. And for everyone watching at home, I'm your host, Sean Goldfaden from Coefficient Labs, and this is Demo Day. Peace, guys.